Episode 20. When you add up all your metacarpals and metatarsals, you've got 20 bones in total. When I was 20 years old, I had the chance to fulfill a bucket list trip, and that was hiking the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. The best athlete to wear the number 20 of all time is Barry Sanders. And in March 2020, we had the fastest bear market on record, and the S&P 500 has rallied 110% since then. Beyond MD, episode 20, here we go. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Beyond MD podcast. I am so thrilled and so grateful that you've taken the time to join me again today. I think it's a great interview today because I have the chance to sit down with Dr. Stephanie Zhou, who has been doing such a phenomenal job injecting financial literacy into medical school curriculums. And I had a chance to sit down with Steph and talk to her for the first time about a few months ago, and I found her so thoughtful and so insightful. I thought she'd be a great fit for the podcast. And the truth is, when I started the podcast in 2020, I really wish that I had some of this content to kind of guide me, especially when I was a trainee, because I believe that it's early and repetitive exposure that helps to build confidence and comfort with these topics. And huge thank you to Stephanie for doing what she's doing in the medical schools today. So we talk about topics that I think are relevant to everybody, but certainly there's going to be a focus on medical trainees, so students and residents. So we're going to be talking about things like lines of credits, the dangers that can potentially exist with leveraged investing, considerations for incorporating, especially when to incorporate. We're also going to be talking about the power of your savings rate, frugality, and much, much more. So Dr. Stephanie Zhou practices addictions medicine at Sunnybrook Hospital and is a lecturer for the financial literacy curriculum at the University of Toronto Temerity Faculty of Medicine. In addition to financial education, she also does research in equity, diversity, and inclusion and co-developed the diversity mentorship program at U of T. Stephanie is a strong advocate for equalizing student knowledge when it comes to personal finance and often combines her two interests in financial education and diversity and inclusion in her lectures. She began by giving affordable medical school webinars to the community of support students before expanding these lectures to a 4-year curriculum. She has worked on the numerous fundraising campaigns at U of T, raising money for needs-based scholarships, and sits on the financial aid committee. And in her spare time, she blogs about personal finance on Instagram and YouTube at Breaking Bad Debt. And with that, here's my interview with Dr. Stephanie Zhou. All right, Steph, welcome to the podcast. Where does the podcast find you?
So I just finished work and I'm just sitting in my home office talking to you, Yatin.
Hey, you know what? I'm so excited to have you here, Steph, because I can tell you when I had kind of my moment in the pandemic and I decided I wanted to start the podcast, to me, I still felt like there was no financial literacy formally in the curriculum. And then I learned about you and I learned about what you were doing. And first off, kudos for bringing this into the curriculum. I think you're doing an amazing job. You've got also a great Instagram handle. And so just really excited to be talking to you today. So thanks for joining me.
Great. Thanks. Likewise to you. I also like your podcast. I recommend it to my students. So I'm glad to be on.
I really appreciate that, Steph. So, Steph, I find your story really, really interesting. And I just want to basically get a sense of kind of what led you to do all this. What led you to promote financial literacy, especially for medical trainees?
Yeah, so there were 2 events that kind of led me to start a financial literacy curriculum. So the first event I kind of talk about in the beginning of my lectures, where the initial idea for a financial literacy curriculum came when I was in residency. And I was working on a fundraising campaign with the University of Toronto, where we raised over $180,000 in needs-based grants. So as part of the fundraising efforts, I attended some donor events where I met the donors who had made donations of $5 million or more. And these were like a small group of folks who had extremely high net worths. And those were the people whose names you would recognize on the walls or the buildings at U of T. So in speaking with them, I kind of learned 2 things. One, I guess none were physicians. There was only one physician there, but they were the spouse of the donor. Many of them were business people or engineers who turned into business people. And the second thing I learned was that these individuals were very financially literate and very entrepreneurial minded. So in doing this whole fundraising campaign, it kind of made me realize that just giving students grants and bursaries, it wasn't enough, because once they graduate, there will no longer be these bursaries anymore. And students will need to rely on their own financial acumen to sustain themselves. So that's why we needed to have a financial curriculum that wasn't taught by like insurance brokers or those with conflicts of interest, that was also adjunctive to the grants that we were giving students. So I kind of began by giving affording medical school webinars to the community of support students. And this is a program to help underrepresented pre-med and medical students gain exposure to the health profession. And this was really positively received. So the feedback then passed on to other students in the class, resulting in interest in this, having this being delivered on a wider scale. The second event that kind of prompted this whole thing was actually Instagram. So I started blogging about personal finance on Instagram. My handle is @BreakingBadDebt before I started giving lectures. It's named Breaking Bad Debt because I do addictions in my day job, and I teach finance. And it's named after the show called Breaking Bad, which is kind of about those two things.
Yeah, it's
and
one of the best shows. Yeah,
exactly. It's like a consistently great show from seasons like 1 to 5, unlike other shows like Game of Thrones.
That was my post radiology call go to. I'd go get like some KFC and I'd go home and I'd start watching Breaking Bad. So anyways.
Exactly. And so I guess like being on social media, that's what kind of allowed me to promote financial literacy beyond U of T. And so the origin of this was actually when a student from the community of support asked, how could they avoid comparing themselves to others in the class who post expensive scrubs, handbags, vacations on Instagram? Or there are Instagrammers out there who might make sponsored posts to encourage peers to buy expensive things. So unfortunately, the highlight reel nature of social media tends to lend itself to comparison and lifestyle inflation, which makes it hard for students to build their net worth when they're spending it on depreciating things to keep up with others. So just kind of in the content of what I teach and what I blog about, I try to emphasize like saving money, normalize being frugal, and also integrate what I do in equity, diversity, and inclusion into my financial content as well. Because I think that is what makes our financial curriculum stand out, because financial education tends to be given mostly by white males with a target of higher income audiences who have a baseline higher financial literacy.
Yeah, Steph, I think that's really important points there. And honestly, like your last point about kind of who typically tends to educate others on financial literacy, that's one of the reasons I actually find kind of your work and what you're doing very refreshing. So, thanks for doing what you do. And just your comment about social media is interesting because I think social media, like you've probably found with Instagram, it's a way for you with like a single post to have a positive impact on many. But then when people are on social media, they're seeing the glitz and glam and all the expensive stuff. And, just as a side story, when I was a resident at Queen's doing radiology, I was talking to one of our PGY2s, and obviously going to keep everything anonymous here. But, this individual told me like, I'm already in a ton of debt. And it was actually like a few $100,000 already. And when I actually kind of just tried to, poke away and figure out what was contributing to that, like it kind of came out, a lot of expensive nights out, just a lot of decisions, kind of material purchases that just added up over time. And so it plays a big role. So I think, frugality, promoting that, emphasizing good decisions, a good savings rate, I think is kind of the start of the journey. So
it's interesting because you said the PGY2 was like around 100,000 in debt.
More, like almost a couple 100,000 already. Yeah.
So that's actually what we're starting to see. Like when you look at the AFMC graduation data, like the average student is now graduating from medical school with 100,000 in debt.
Yeah, that's scary to know that that's just medical school, and then kind of what happens beyond that as well. So, speaking of medical school, Steph, I kind of want to get a sense of, you're lecturing the students. And so I'm sure they ask you questions and you're probably picking up on certain trends that are happening. I've come across certain trends as well, but I'd like to hear from you. What are you kind of, noticing? Like what's happening when it comes to a trainee's financial decisions?
Yeah, so I would just summarize this, and I guess there are actually a lot of trends, but I would just summarize it into two just for time.
Yeah.
And the two biggest one that I'll comment on, and maybe I think a lot of your listeners would value your opinion on this as well, is, number one, leveraged investing in the line of credit, and number two, incorporation, especially incorporating too early. So let's talk a little bit about the first one, like leveraged investing with the line of credit. So just to define leveraged investing, because some people don't know what that term means, it's basically using borrowed money to invest. That's called leverage. And the most common form of leveraged investing is actually getting a mortgage. So we've actually seen some students using their line of credit to put towards a down payment in a property, or they put their line of credit into stocks as well. So in the work that I do with the financial aid office, a student actually approached one of our financial counselors saying that they have 200,000 in debt, but because the line of credit is 350,000, they wanted to know if they should invest some of it because the average stock market returns is about 6%, while their line of credit interest at that time, or I guess currently, is 2.45%, minus 0.25 the prime. And their reasoning is actually if they invest it, then they can make that difference of, let's say, 3.55% in returns, and that can actually help accelerate their debt payments. However, we were talking about this earlier, but at the Canadian Physicians Financial Wellness Conference, which happened this November, I actually asked that exact leveraged investing question to both Doctors Jane and Paul Healy, as well as Ben Felix, who is a financial advisor, and Mark Soth, who's the author of the Looney Doctor blog. And all of them literally said this was a risky thing to do, and I agree. So the reason why that is, and based on all of our answers, so you're getting like 5 people's answers on this, including like yours later on as well, Yatin. But it actually comes down to the lack of cash flow a trainee has, which is usually none or very little to cushion the losses. And secondly, the student is assuming that after 4 years, only 4 years of investing in the stock market, their assets will go up. But often students haven't lived through these market crashes, and 4 years is a very short horizon. The other wrong assumption here is that the student assumes that the line of credit interest rate will remain low, which is not always the case, because if it doubles, then the percent returns will further shrink. Finally, line of credit debt is also considered an unsecured loan. So for example, like a mortgage is considered a secured loan because it's secured by that property as collateral, right? But an unsecured loan are often callable, which means that the bank can ask for its money back at any time. So for example, if there's a market crash, or if you fail medical school, or if you have to take a year off for whatever reason and you're no longer enrolled as a student, then you don't have that enrollment letter to confirm you're a medical student. Whereas, you're holding a medical professional line of credit. So if you can't prove that you're a medical student anymore, then the bank can call the money back. And, if you can't pay that money back, or you're forced to sell your stocks at a loss, then it actually puts you into a worse cycle of debt. The other scenario I wanted to comment on is when residents use their line of credit to top up a down payment for a home. So where I have seen this done manageably is actually when the resident is married to someone who might not be a resident. So for example, they're in nursing, business, school teacher, like for example, like those are some examples where they actually started making income after undergrad. And that partner actually already has some, a nice bucket of savings, stable, consistent income with little or no debt due to that early start. So there you go. You have that dual income couple, and that dual income is helping to cushion housing costs and the mortgage costs, which can range from like $1,700 to $3,000 a month at the 2% interest rate, depending on the cost of the home. So where I've seen this being extremely risky is, let's say you have a resident with only 50 to 60K annual income, and they also have student debt. They use part of their line of credit for a down payment, and then they get approved by the bank for a $1 million mortgage because the bank doesn't really do their due diligence when it comes to doctors, I find. They just give doctors a projected income of 150. Yeah, exactly. The 150 to 200K instead of their actual income. So now that resident has to pay the mortgage interest on top of line of credit interest, on top of mortgage insurance and their student debt payment. And then all of that is on like a 5K a month salary. So that's setting you up to ruin your credit score. And the credit score is pretty important because it's like a number that tells lenders, whether they should actually give you favorable rates on borrowing in the future, how risky it is to lend to you. So the other thing I just forgot to mention was, you don't pay tax in your first year of practice when you graduate residency. You pay it in the second year. So when you declare your first year of your staff income to the CRA, then that's when you'll get hit with a big tax bill that you pay retroactively. So I like to keep my line of credit, some space available because then I can kind of use that a bit as an emergency fund to help cover those taxes.
Yeah, Steph, I think everything you said is very, very logical. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there. I mean, I can offer my perspective too. So for me, it's like, okay, I did not start investing early enough, but it's never too late. So, but I just believe that, before you start to invest, whether it's into the markets, whether it's into your house, like I just feel like you need to have a plan, like in case an emergency happens, because life can change, in the blink of an eye, and you just need to be ready. So I have to be ready to look after myself, my wife, and my two boys. So that's kind of first and foremost. And the thing about markets, like yeah, we've obviously been in a amazing bull market apart from the COVID correction, but the reality is that we cannot control market returns, and so none of us have invested through. At least you and I have not. I don't think like we haven't invested through the post-dot-com bubble, where from 2000 to 2002, there were 3 straight years where we had negative returns in the stock market. So none of us have been there, but it can happen, right? So, and that's out of my control. So if I was going to take leverage, a line of credit, and invest into the markets thinking, hey, I'm guaranteed 6 to 7%, that's not correct. One other point I will raise is that I have had the chance to talk with several medical students this year, and they have been just wonderful, wonderful conversations. But leverage investing does tend to come up. So I know people are interested in it. And one thing I have been hearing is that some medical students are using their line of credit to invest in cryptocurrency. So listen, I'm not here to give people investment advice, but if that's something that you have done and you have made money, first off, I'm really happy for you. But you've essentially won the lottery, and that is a very, very risky proposition. I'm somebody who looks at various perspectives in the matter, and when I listen to the bulls in cryptocurrency, even they will say, do not invest in cryptocurrency using leverage. It's very risky. I honestly would just caution people against it. And I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with cryptocurrency. There's not. I invest in it myself, but we can't predict the future, and you don't want to be setting yourself up for a debt disaster. I think your points about the unsecured line of credit are very valid, because I can tell you actually this was a more recent experience for me where I had a line of credit, but over a certain time frame, that line of credit didn't fluctuate enough. And so I got a message from the bank and they wanted to actually do a review on the line of credit. So, here I am, like I'm a staff physician. I've been practicing for 6 years and I'm having a line of credit undergo a review. Everything was fine because I'm fortunate to have, stable cash flow. But if you're not in that position, like you said, an unsecured line of credit, it can be yanked away. That is the real world. And then, yeah, if you're putting yourself in a position where you're using leverage to invest, it doesn't work out, you're potentially setting up a disaster when it comes to your credit score. And you're talking to somebody who's actually, gone through a blip in his credit score. So my situation was kind of minor, actually. There was my first car. It was a Nissan Versa, and I moved a lot for my medical training. So I bought it in Vancouver, moved to Kingston, and then switched bank accounts. And then they couldn't get a hold of that last payment, Steph, that one last payment. And it went so late that from 2013 to 2019, my credit score took actually a big dip. And it was a real pain for me because in that time, we were actually looking for a house and then questions kept coming up. So if I can just advise anybody, yeah, like you want to do whatever you can to make the right decisions to set yourself up for success. Leveraged investing has to be something that's done with a lot of caution. I personally have only done it for real estate. I've actually never done it other than that. And, for me, I want to control what I control and I want to make sure I'm sleeping okay at night. So that's kind of my approach. I think it reiterates a lot of what you said.
Yeah, I think a lot of students, when they see that, 350K in their bank account, like they have that assumption that it's theirs, when in fact it's actually not their money, it's the bank's money.
Yeah,
and
yeah, for sure.
I don't know, maybe it's like an immigrant mentality for me, but I feel like whenever it's someone else's money, I have to like be even more cautious about how I'm using it. Like think of it another way. Let's say the 350K was lent to you by a family member. Would you be still investing that into crypto? Whereas the intention for that money for you is actually for your education. So that's kind of how I sort of think about it. And that's why I'm very cautious about how I'm using my line of credit, especially as you mentioned, Yatin, about the line of credit reviews.
Yeah, it's a reality. You know what? It's happened to me. It's happened to other people out there. So, you know what? Proceed with caution. So yeah, I mean, Steph, I think you also wanted to touch on this is it's a
Like the
timeless question. I guess
incorporation
the
piece, right?
corporation. You know what?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Maybe, I've done some thinking around this. I'll get your input first, and I'll kind of offer what I have to
Sure,
say as well.
sure, sounds good. So, like, I wanted to bring up the incorporation piece because recently I was at a dinner with two radiology residents. So I'm just going to shout out that it's Arash and Charlotte.
Yeah, Arash
Really
is,
great
by the way,
folks.
yeah, he's
Yeah,
rotating with us right now. He's got, yeah,
that's great.
really enjoyed
Yeah,
working with him.
I'll,
Yeah.
I'll put in a good word for him. Very, very competent, like functions at a staff physician level.
Oh, he's a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
he's in his rural college year, and so that's actually something on his mind at the moment. Because any graduating resident about to enter practice, they're thinking, okay, should I incorporate right out of residency, or should I take some time to do it, right? So one of the biggest reasons why anyone would want to incorporate is due to tax deferral. So any sort of active income in a corp is taxed at a lower rate than money made actively personally. However, when you look at the TFSA and the RRSP, those are actually better tax advantage accounts compared to the corp. So you'd want to max those first. And especially if you're needing, let's say, high liquidity for like a down payment, you should then save for that next. There's no point in incorporating if you're just going to take the money out towards a down payment. Next, you also want to think about the stability of your job and your income. So I remember some folks will graduate residency, then they will do locums, right? And so not everyone graduates residency with a job that pays that stable staff income. So if you're locuming, you might be making like staff income for a month or two, and then you followed by no income at all. And that makes your income really fluctuant. So it makes your income look lower than it actually is. So the other thing is when I graduated residency, I
Mhm.
also didn't get my billing number until September.
Mhm.
And I actually didn't get paid until November, as billings
Yeah.
tend to be 1 month behind when you
Yeah.
submit them. So it didn't make sense for me to be paying the higher accountant fees, which were around $3,000 to $4,000. That varies based on geographic location. So I'm in Toronto; it's a bit more expensive here,
Yeah.
as well incorporation fees. So I paid around $1,000 for the OMA to incorporate for me, but there's
Yeah.
also CPSO fees with the College of Physicians and Surgeons as well. So if at the time, like when I first graduated residency, let's say I wasn't really making anything when I first graduated, no billing number, and I also didn't really know how to bill efficiently, like those are all like fees that are going out with nothing coming in. Generally, what my accountant told me is if you can keep around 100,000 in the corp, then it might be something you want to consider. The other thing to keep in mind as a misconception is that residents often think incorporation gives you additional tax deductions, but actually, like even as a sole proprietor, you can still deduct the same things like the home office expenses, overhead payments, car payments, licensing or CME expenses. Those can still be done as a sole proprietor.
Yeah.
Just to kind of think about the flip side, right? So to give a bit more of a balanced answer, I guess one benefit of incorporating out of residency, assuming you've met all of the, criteria that was aforementioned, is actually for organization. So let's say when you graduate, you have your corporate account set up and you have your corporate credit card set up, and that's all separate from your personal credit card, personal account, right? So
Mhm.
then you have that organization right off the bat,
Yep.
rather than, halfway, through the year or later on, 2 years later, then you change your billings to have to go to from your personal account instead to go to your corporate account. And then later on, you have to separate your corporate and personal account.
Yeah.
So I guess that's like the one benefit I could think of to incorporating right out of residency. What
Yeah.
are your thoughts?
Yeah. You know what? It's just a great question. It is a timeless question. So I'll talk about what happened to me. So I started working as a radiologist in Alberta in 2016. And the way things work in Alberta is when you start, you're an associate, but kind of the gap in salary between an associate and a full-fledged partner it's a lot different in Alberta than, let's say, Ontario. So my initial salary for the first year was $300,000. Unfortunately, I didn't know like an ETF from a mutual fund at that point. I knew what an RRSP was. I had a minimal amount in a TFSA, but I had no RRSP investments at the time. But I was basically told by whichever accountant I was working with at the time that you should incorporate to save tax immediately. And I was like, oh, okay. So I didn't know any better. So I did it. But looking back at kind of how the year unfolded for us, Steph, it was not the right decision for me at the time. And I'll briefly kind of talk about why. One is, yeah. So if I look at the literature, and I use Jamie Golenbeck's literature on basically if you have a balanced portfolio, how is it going to perform in a TFSA, RRSP versus the corp? So yeah, like the RRSP, TFSA over time are going to be a little bit more efficient, even though if you are an incorporated physician, I think in the long term, just because of the magnitude of your corporate account, like
Yeah, the size,
the
right?
RSP is going to be smaller, but it's going to be a more tax efficient growth of your money. That's just what the literature shows.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree on that. So for me, I didn't have any of that. So because I incorporated right away, um, maybe didn't make all that much sense. And then once we got the first paycheck, we got excited. And then we decided right away, 2 months into a rental, to buy a house. So basically, then like everything, bonus, whatever had gone into the corporation came right out of the corporation. So basically, by the year end that year, I had no tax deferral. So for me, I also was I didn't go about incorporating the right way in the sense that it was complicated. I had a tax lawyer who was working at a different rate than my accountant. And when the accountant caught up, said, "Oh my God, I don't agree with the share structure of this corporation. We need to redo all the articles again." And I kid you not, that first year with the paperwork and just the back and forth, I spent easily $10,000. And so
Wow, it's high.
very high. So now my kind of corporate and personal kind of accounting fees combined are about 3,000. But back then it was just so inefficient. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I lost all that money. I didn't defer any tax. We decided to buy the house. So your example of, having to make a significant down payment. If you have all those things happening in your life, like, yeah, I don't think it makes sense for the average physician to necessarily incorporate right away. But I guess I'll offer like not a contrarian view, but I'll just throw in a few factors. So like, let's say, you're starting out as a specialist and you are very fortunate to have a very high income. And like, let's say you're living in, you could be living in Toronto, you could be living in Vancouver, but, let's say you're living in like, Moncton, New Brunswick. If you kind of take the job stability, the income, and then the cost of living, well, then one could certainly make, I think, an argument for incorporating early, maybe even right away, if, you feel like you're leaving enough in the corp. I might just kind of say, I also know a few physicians who have done really, really well with a very kind of focused approach to investing. So some physicians are exclusively focused in real estate. And those physicians, and I'm not saying people should do this, but this is just more like a case by case scenario. Those physicians prefer to leave money in the corporation, then they'll move it to the holding company. So it's worked for some. Again, not a strategy for all. And then, you know what? Kudos to some of my colleagues at North York General Hospital. I mean, I talked to many people who have said, listen, we're renting for life and we're not necessarily going to buy a house. So I guess if you're in that setting, you don't need to have that massive kind of outflux of money, then, one could maybe make an argument for incorporating right away. I love your point about the tax deductions. Yeah, when it comes to your practice, whatever you can deduct from the corp, you should be able to deduct as a sole proprietor, right? I guess the only thing I'll add to it, and I know I saw your video on, when to incorporate on YouTube. I thought it was just phenomenal. And I know at the end you even touched on this, but kind of for later in the career, additional tax deductions when you look at things like pension plans, etc. Certainly nothing that anybody needs to look at early on, but just some things to consider down the road. So my answer is maybe not the most satisfying one, but I think that for many people, you probably don't need to go ahead and incorporate on day one. Like, I think it really depends on your income, job stability, cost of living. Do you have a massive down payment coming up? And then kind of what's your status with investing in your tax advantaged accounts? I think those are kind of like the four big things that, I would kind of look at. I'll leave it there for myself. But.
Yeah, something I actually just wanted to ask you about, because you said you incorporated in Alberta, but I understand you moved to Ontario now, right? So
Yes.
I'm sure there are some residents who are probably in that situation where they're finishing up their training in a different province, but that province may not be their, place where they want to settle down, right? So were there any challenges with, switching that from Alberta all the way to Ontario?
It's a very good question. And at the time, I have to say, the answer I was getting, there was a lot of uncertainty in that answer. So the advice that I was given, the easiest thing was, if I stopped funding the corporation in Alberta and just it would kind of eventually wind itself down. So if there's at least a year that went with any money going into it, that entity would essentially dissolve on its own. And
Right.
so rather than putting in the fees to kind of, take back those articles and then pay again to incorporate in Ontario, the advice I was given was just, leave that one alone. And then I moved to Ontario, and I had left the Alberta one alone. But then what happened was when I came to Ontario, I had, a better income here just because of how things were set up with the practice. And we were renting for a bit. So yeah, there we go. I incorporated again. But then it resulted actually in a CRA audit because I was incorporated in Alberta, and then I had another corporation here. And so, you know what? The CRA officer, he came to my house and he just said, you know what? They gave me notice, obviously, 3 weeks. Said have all your paperwork, all your minute books open and just ready for review. And it took about 3 hours. And my son was like screaming upstairs, crying, and the CRA officer was actually just like, "Hey," he's like, "That's what happens when the tax man comes to your house, right?" Like
Did they
nobody was
actually
happy. Yeah.
did
So
they
they did
actually
an
look
audit.
like
Yeah, they
sorry, I
came
was
to my
gonna
house. He walked in with a briefcase
wow.
and just looked at everything, and it was okay. Fortunately, I was very stressed out about it, but
Yeah.
that's what happened because I think I had two corporations technically running at the same time.
I guess that's another reason for, waiting to incorporate, right? Like you never know where you're going to settle down, and the corporation rules are a little bit different province to province.
Totally. And you know what? Some of the advice I was maybe given a bit earlier was, hey, you know what? Your down payment money for your future house, save up in the corp. And like, you know what? Just pull it out as a massive shareholder loan after. And then that came to bite me because it's not just like free money. You can't just like take it out of your corp and dump it into your house because I mean, this is like a conversation for another day, but then I realized that really wasn't the right strategy. So then there you go again. It's just like, okay, how do I save up for the down payment on the house? So that's a big thing to consider too, I think, before you decide to pull the trigger on incorporating.
Yeah, very true.
And so, Steph, now that you've kind of been, formally lecturing, on financial literacy in the curriculum, kind of like, how do you see this kind of evolving, and how do you see it kind of moving in the future?
Yeah, so where I kind of see financial literacy now, it was kind of similar to where, equity, diversity, and inclusion was back in 2016, 2017. So back then, I was actually like, other than this financial education stuff that I do, I also do research specifically in equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. I'll call that EDIB for short.
Yep.
And at that time, I was trying to publish articles on EDIB, and I received so many rejections. I also started this program at U of T called Diversity Mentorship Program, and I wanted to publish a paper on that, but that paper also got rejected like a few times until this year when it was finally published with, all of the current events bringing up issues of race and inequity. And you look at where EDIB is now, it's basically an accreditation standard at every medical conference you go to. There's diversity statements, there's entire journals and their volumes are dedicated to it. So it's a very different climate now than it was before when I was starting this research. So what you're kind of doing with this podcast and, the listeners supporting this podcast, I would say that it's considered on the early adopters phase of the bell curve. And you're kind of at the cusp of seeing mainstream change happen. Right now, there is like little or no research projects presented as CCME or other medical education conferences. I think the research coming from a multi-institutional study that we're working on with McGill, it might be one of the first. Having started that Physicians Financial Wellness Conference, we actually had a medical student, Eric, come and present research on the Dalhousie financial literacy curriculum, which I think this conference helps set a precedent and platform for those who are doing research on this or interested in this topic before the more conventional conferences start picking it up. Having been involved in this financial education stuff at the med student, the resident, and now staff physician level through this conference, I can definitely see that there is change happening from the ground up. Students are actually driving this change through personal finance clubs, starting their own financial speakers event outside of class hours. And I think moving forward, it will become a more formalized part of the med student or resident curriculum. I wouldn't say like financial education as a whole is a nascent field per se. It's just in its early stages, specifically in medicine, just because we've never really prioritized financial independence or, it would have been taboo for doctors to be talking about our finances.
Yeah, Steph, I think it's so nice to see some of the learners driving this change. And I have no doubt that you, through your lectures, are kind of empowering them to do so. So I have to reiterate it. It's really great what you're doing. And in terms of finance being a taboo, like, yeah, I know traditionally in medicine, we maybe don't talk about it as much, but I think as we expose people, as they start to talk about it more, become more comfortable with it, it's certainly not going to be a taboo topic anymore. And I don't think it is anymore. I think physician financial independence has also played a really, really big role there. And, like when I think about money and kind of what its role is, I really believe it to be kind of a surrogate for time. So if we're fortunate enough to be doing, well financially, then we have more time to kind of live out and enjoy the more meaningful things in our life day to day. So that's kind of what I try to keep in the back of my mind. Like, what's the mission behind all of this? So, Steph, I did have a chance to kind of go through your Instagram profile. I really enjoyed it. I think you're doing a great job kind of taking these personal stories and sharing it with people and then incorporating finance into it. And, one thing I kind of got from it is that, the way you live your life, that you're frugal. And like, I just wanted to get a sense of, maybe you can comment on this. Were you kind of always frugal? Were there certain, experiences that kind of led you to live life this way? I'd love to hear.
Yeah, sure. So I just want to clarify first for the audience, what is the difference between the word frugal and cheap?
Yeah.
So because people often get those confused, right?
Yeah.
So being cheap means looking solely at the lowest cost rather than the value or the quality of the item or service. Being frugal means to maximize the value of an item, including the value of your time, as you mentioned, and being practical about your spending, taking into consideration bigger picture goals for your money rather than short-term wants. So having defined this, and to answer your question, I wasn't always frugal.
Mm-hmm.
My family and I were actually cheap first because of our low socioeconomic status in the beginning. So for example, like for all of my elementary school years, my parents would buy an entire pizza on Sunday and a crate of pop or juice. And then I would have a slice of pizza and pop for lunch every single day for almost 6 years. Yeah.
Oh,
and
geez.
I used to bring like Chinese food leftovers from dinner, but then like students are mean, they like bullied me because of the smell or the look of the food. So it was just pizza and pop every day from then on, because that was socially accepted at the time.
Wow.
Yeah. Sometimes I guess we would switch it up with instant noodles. So my parents, some people hear me say that and they're just like, wow, I can't believe like you grew up on this kind of stuff. But my parents did this simply because food was just sustenance. It wasn't nutrition. Like they didn't have that knowledge that those of us as doctors have about the long-term impact of unhealthy eating on childhood development and then the risk factors for heart disease and so on. When I started becoming frugal was actually when I was in undergrad. And in my readings, I came across something called the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness.
Okay.
And this starts off by saying, and I quote, "The reason why the rich was so rich was because they managed to spend less money." And that quote captured my attention because growing up poor, I thought, okay, how is this possible? We really try to pinch pennies on food, like clothing came from the church donation bin, like everything had to be the cheapest, as cheap as possible, or free. And so the theory behind like what this theory says is that when you look at a pair of boots, for example, there are cheap boots that might cost $10, but they lasted for a season or two, and then they leaked and developed holes after. And then you have an expensive pair of boots that cost $50 that lasted for years. But when you're low income and you only have $30, then you can only afford the cheap boots and not the expensive one. So a person who could have higher income and afford the $50 boots would be keeping their feet dry in like 10 years, while the poor person who could only afford cheap boots would have spent hundreds of dollars on those boots in the same time and still have their feet wet. And then I guess you would have the bootless, right? And then as Martin Luther King, I think he said a quote, something like, "It's all right to tell a man to lift himself by the bootstraps, but it's just cruel just to say to a bootless man he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps." And, I can definitely get into the economics of poverty, which is something I read a lot about, but, that's like a huge topic for another time. But bringing that to like now, I guess, now my income is probably like 10 times what my parents used to make combined. And so now I definitely value frugality over cheapness. I'm willing to spend a little bit more money on things that are longer lasting or food that's more nutritious to, make up for all those years of
pizza,
high cholesterol, high sugar foods. Yeah. And I'm also very committed to try to live a life of inner richness and having purpose rather than spending my money on things that might make me look rich on the outside or making more money for the sake of watching the numbers in my bank account grow without having any end purpose for it. So now I strive to have more purpose with my money, and that is actually in the form of philanthropy.
Steph, that is such an amazing message. Like what you just, how you captured all that, how your past experiences kind of, I think, shaped how you approach things and look at things, and just now you're kind of focused on philanthropy. I think that's amazing. I think you summed up frugality versus cheapness really well. I can tell you that, like, so you have this figured out. Back in the day, like I did not have it figured out. So I would go, I remember this one day I actually I went to Walmart, and I was there to actually just pick up some milk because the kids needed it the next day. And then I just started strolling around, and I was like, oh wow, look at these, like, cool colored pants, and they're like $29.99. And I was just like, I took them home, tried them. I was like, oh, they fit like a glove, just meant to be. And I showed my wife. I was like, check out this deal. And then 6 months later, it was just all faded, looking terrible. I actually just recently like chucked them out of my closet. But now what my wife started doing for me in the pandemic is she bought me my first pair of Lululemon pants. And like, if there's one thing that I could have focused more on and spent a bit more money on, it would be Lululemon pants, because they last me forever. They're so comfortable. So yeah, you pay a bit more upfront, but then you've got some quality to kind of last you for some time. So that's my own kind of personal example.
Yeah. I think like healthcare providers can get 25% discount with their healthcare badge. Just an FYI.
At Lululemon?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Something I was doing during the pandemic was looking up where all the healthcare providers can get discounts. Wow. And that was one of them I remembered.
Okay, that's amazing. I'll have to share that with my wife as well. But yeah. Okay, so now that we're talking about kind of spending money, like you come across to me as a very organized person. So just in terms of budgeting, can you talk to me about how you kind of budget and kind of how important that is for you as you kind of live your day to day?
Yeah, like the best analogy I can make to the way I kind of budget is, I'm not sure if you saw the Netflix show. It's called Maid. It's basically about a single mom trying to afford housing and groceries for her child. And in several scenes, it actually has she's in the grocery store, and on the side of the screen, it has like the numbers of the cost of stuff tallied up. And as she puts stuff in her cart or puts stuff out of the cart, it like subtracts and adds onto that budget that's rolling on the screen. So that's actually very similar to what my family had to deal with growing up. And then on top of that, you have to add on like a language barrier as well. And so it was pretty tough growing up with my parents, right?
For sure.
And that's basically how I budgeted or learned how to budget. And that's the way I did it throughout med school and residency when my income levels were lower. The way I budget is more micromanaged, for lack of a better word, than some other people might do, such as, the Healy's or Mark or Ben. Like all of them, when I asked them this question at the conference, they said they take a philosophical approach to budgeting rather than micromanaging everything on spreadsheets like I do. I don't know, maybe Mark Soth, he probably tracks everything on spreadsheets as well. So basically, like for myself, I use an Excel spreadsheet because I like to look at trends in my spending patterns. And also because some accountants prefer that you fill in a spreadsheet, because they will use that to file your taxes come tax time. Others I know use budgeting apps that integrate with their bank account or credit cards to make it more passive. I personally do not endorse any apps just because I haven't used them myself. But what I would encourage your listeners to do is to Google like best budgeting apps in Canada or read some reviews first about the benefits and especially about the risks of budgeting apps. In terms of what items or categories I have on my like columns of my spreadsheet. So I used to file my own taxes since undergrad and med school. And that was before I got an accountant. But there's this form called the Statement of Business or Professional Activities. I think it's the T2125, I believe. But if you Google the name of that form, you'll probably find it.
Good to know.
And on that form, it actually has a list of deductible expenses like meals, office expenses, rent, etc. So although some of those didn't apply to me at certain stages in my life, that's kind of what I used as a general guide to classify my expenses on each of the columns of my spreadsheet.
That sounds like a good way to kind of organize the way we
and it's good for the accountant as well, because that's what they're using to fill in when they're doing their taxes for you. So because budgeting, I would say, is very personal and it can change based on stage in your career or how many kids you have. I guess I'll try to give a bit more general advice then about how Because some people ask about what percent should they allocate to rent versus lifestyle and savings and so on, right? So there's something called a 50-30-20 rule, and that actually was developed by Elizabeth Warren, the senator. And basically what it says is it's 50% for needs. So needs as in like housing, utilities, food, transportation, 30% on wants. So that's like what, Netflix, dining out, and 20% on savings. So for example, down payment or saving for your retirement and so on. Now, if you're a med student and you don't have that consistent income, how I created my budget is I just took my total line of credit amount. Back then, it was $200,000. I divided that by the 6 or 10 years I was going to be a trainee, depending on how long my med school was, how long my residency was going to be. Then I divided that amount by 12 months. And that was kind of like the max of what I can spend on a monthly basis. When you actually do it that way, you see what seems to be like a pretty large line of credit doesn't look that big anymore when it comes to the monthly amount. Like when I did all those calculations, it came out to be about like 3,300 something on a monthly basis.
Wow.
And it's a very rough way of doing it, but it's a general guideline.
Oh, that sounds like a great way to kind of break things down and kind of spit out a realistic monthly number, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while I have most of my payments automated, I still check all my accounts and credit cards weekly or bi-weekly just to make sure everything's consistent. I have email notifications and the multi-factor authentication set up as well. Just because like other people, I've also had close calls with identity theft, whereas, someone had tried to change the banking info on my CRA account and then applied for CERB in my name. But before the CERB deposit could get deposited into that other person's bank account that wasn't mine, I had actually gotten an email notification that the info was changed. So I changed it back to my own account. And then the next day I got the CERB deposits in my own bank account, even though I never applied for it.
Interesting.
One app that I would recommend to your listeners is called Credit Karma. That tracks my credit score, which we were talking about earlier. And it tells me whenever a new credit card or bank account was opened in my name. So there was once when I had another close call where I got an email notification from Credit Karma, actually, that I had opened a credit card, but it was not me who opened it. So luckily, I was able to resolve that very quickly. The other tip I would give to your listeners is to get fraud alert with both TransUnion and Equifax. And a lot of people think it's expensive, but it's not. It's free because the government mandates these credit companies to have these fraud alerts stay on your file for 6 years for extra protection. And then finally, the one last tip I'll give is for those who don't want to take as much of a micromanaged approach, like I do to budgeting, is if you were to track anything, at least you should track your TFSA contributions. Many people rely on just checking their CRA account just to see how much TFSA room they have, but this isn't usually up to date. Especially if you don't make lump sum contributions, you should keep track of how much you're contributing, because otherwise you hear stories of people over contributing and there will be penalties if you do.
You know what? That's a really good point because now it's very easy to, I think, open up multiple TFSAs. You can have more than one RSP, and just when you get into the habit of making these small contributions, you can easily lose track. So I think that's a great point. And I've seen this come up on forums. Like I over contributed, now what's going to happen? And just your point on fraud, I think it's a really good point. And I've encountered credit card fraud on my own end as well. So I have the habit of checking my credit card statements every month. So that's just a habit I've had, and it's worked out well for me because there was one time where I did pick up an $1,100 charge.
Oh, wow.
And it was actually for an air ticket. And so I called Visa, and first off, they just said, you know what, good on you to check your credit card statement. And they're like, let's look into this, contacted the airline. And so they're like, yeah, so is your name Enrique? And I was like, no, absolutely not. And they're like, yeah, well, so there's an air ticket here, round trip to Mexico City, purchased for Enrique. And I was just like, well, is it Enrique Iglesias? Because that would have been
I would have paid for it.
Maybe worth it for the $1,100, but it wasn't him. But anyways, they didn't charge me for that, but it can be significant. So I've encountered it twice, the biggest being over $1,000. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it's good you got your money back.
Yeah, totally. So, Steph, we've talked a lot about saving, a lot about frugality. And, I just want to emphasize, to everybody, I really do believe when you're starting out earlier, I really feel like the savings rate I think it's the most important thing, because if you don't save, you have nothing really to invest and build upon. But we've talked a lot about that. I just want to know, Steph, I'm curious, is there anything previously or currently in your life that maybe you wish you maybe spent more money on, whether it was something, maybe a material, or even more importantly, like an experience? Is there anything in your life?
So it's hard to answer that question because I can't really think of anything that I wanted to spend more on, given that I just have a pretty low standard of what makes me happy.
Yeah.
Like I didn't grow up with an expensive lifestyle. So it's like you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So when my first staff paycheck hit my bank account, I guess my splurge was actually a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store. It's actually so sad just to say that, because for me, like I could just see myself like with my staff paycheck just sitting by myself eating my rotisserie chicken at home. But the reason behind that was actually because when I was growing up, my mom would often get a bonus during the holidays, and then we splurged on a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store or like a bubble tea. So though, like bubble tea is like another thing I could talk a lot about. It's like happiness in a cup.
Oh yeah.
That's like associated with happy memories
For me and my sister as well, actually.
Yeah,
But go on.
it's so good.
Yeah.
And as an addictions physician, you know, we often talk about patients developing tolerances to substances, right? And it's the same thing with spending as well. Like you get that initial high when you open the Amazon package or you unwrap that designer clothing, but then you develop tolerance to these material goods, and then you're just looking for the next high. So I think there's a lot of experiences that you don't actually need a lot of money for to give you enjoyment.
Yeah.
So like going on a hike, painting or reading, having a potluck with friends, like those are all things that I personally do that bring me a lot of happiness, but it doesn't cost a lot of money.
You know, Steph, I think that's such an important point just to highlight the experiences. So you highlighted a few experiences that were really important to you. Like I love the rotisserie chicken. I mean, that's something that, you know, myself and my two boys, we are quite reliant on rotisserie chicken. We all enjoy it. And then bubble tea, you know what? Like it's amazing. Like when I catch up with my sister, and inevitably we will go to like, you know, a restaurant that has, you know, some ethnic food. It's often going to be a Chinese restaurant, but then she will want to find a place with bubble tea because that's just been a way for us to connect. So it brings back so many memories. That definitely strikes a chord with me. So Steph, you know what? Because you're known to the public, known to the students. I think people often have an interest in kind of, you know, how are you and, you know, how are you kind of going about investing? Like maybe you can just shed a bit of light on your general approach as we kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it would also be interesting to see how you're investing as well, right? Because I think the more prospective students get, the better.
Sure.
So for myself, I'm personally a buy and hold investor, as I've only ever sold a stock once since I started to invest. And I think I've been investing for about 9 years now. I actually began by buying individual stocks just because at that time, I didn't really know about the asset allocation ETFs, or maybe they didn't exist yet. And what I mean by asset allocation ETFs is some people might have heard of VGRO or XEQT, like those kind of things. And then I read this book. It's called The Intelligent Investor.
Yes.
And that's what kind of introduced me to long-term value investing. Not getting caught up in short-term hype like we're seeing today, right? Like people getting caught up into like different types of cryptos, but there are also a lot of the, you know, various different types of cryptos out there, right? So what that book kind of taught me was like, you know, remember you only lose money when you sell at a loss.
Absolutely.
But if you buy and hold over decades, then you'll most likely gain.
Yep.
There's another paper. I don't know how somehow in my readings, I don't know how I kind of got into that rabbit hole, but I ended up finding John Bogle's paper in the Journal of Portfolio Management. It's called like Lightning Strikes, and it was about the creation of Vanguard and the first index mutual fund. I think I summarized the key points of that paper on an Instagram post. But basically it compared, like it was published in the 70s, and it compared index investing to stock investing. And that was actually the first time I started considering index investing. I was like, okay, what is this? And this is basically investing in an entire market rather than individual stocks, right? So it's simply like casting a wider net rather than trying to catch individual fish, hoping it'll be the next big catch. So for my majority of my equities portfolio is pretty diversified, composed a lot of ETFs that capture global markets in Asia, Europe, Canada, and the US. There are some growth and dividend stocks that I had bought a while back in the TFSA, and I'm trying to add more asset allocation ETFs just to diversify that a bit more.
Yep.
In the RRSP, I have US and foreign market stocks and ETFs. In the Corp, I have similarly broadly diversified ETF portfolio as well as real estate. And then outside of that, I also have a high interest savings account that I use for emergency fund, real estate
Yes.
investments, things like that. I've definitely like done research and looked at Bitcoin and options, but however, like I don't think they are for me. Like it's like what they say, like Black Friday in the stock market world be like a drop of like 10 to 20%, but that's just like a regular Friday in the Bitcoin world.
It
So
is.
that's why I personally don't invest in that.
Yeah. No, you know what? All very wise. And yeah, I can shed some light on kind of how I do things. I'll maybe kind of break it down more objectively into accounts first and then kind of get into my
Sure.
just rough philosophy. So yeah, so the corporation, so what I try to do there is I try to hold more of my growth equities and then basically my Canadian dividend paying stocks. And then I have ETFs as well. And that's just because of more kind of preferential tax treatment of a Canadian dividend in the corp compared to a US dividend. So that's kind of my corporation setup. I also, when my RRSP right now, it's exclusively US dividend paying stocks, just because of the foreign withholding tax implications. If it wasn't in a tax sheltered account like an RRSP, my TFSA is a bit of a grab bag. That's maybe where I tend to pick a few more stocks. A lot of it is kind of dividend growth stocks in there, and then there are also some growth names with maybe some higher returns. In terms of Bitcoin, yeah. So, here's where I can kind of talk about my philosophy a bit. The decision I made was, I don't think anybody fully understands it. I try to latch on to pieces of information to guide me as best as I can. But I'm willing to put kind of up to 5% of my portfolio in there, and that way, if it kind of tanks, I'm still sleeping at night. And you know what? If it continues to be adopted and it continues to grow, that's something I don't really want to miss out on. So there's risk involved, but it's a risk that I'm totally okay kind of living with. So, I don't think it's going to go to zero, but if it did, I'd still be sleeping at night. So that's kind of my approach there.
Are you putting that in your TFSA?
So I have a proxy play on Bitcoin. It's one of the miners. That's the only kind of Bitcoin play that I hold in my TFSA. But the rest of it is actually majority ETFs. I haven't actually gone onto the exchanges yet, but I think if I get more into it, that's probably the next step. But again, up to 5%. And then, yeah, recently we were kind of saving up for a kitchen renovation. I didn't want to play with that money. So I put all of that into a high interest savings account. It gave me some return for 3 months and that money is safe. So that's kind of my approach. But then the buy and hold stuff, I couldn't agree more. So I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, when I have sold something, I have come to regret it. And maybe it's just because we've been investing in this, in this time frame where things just continue to go up. But every time I sell, it just continues to go up. And like you said, you only lose when you kind of sell at a loss. So my philosophy is also buy and hold. And then the last thing I'll kind of leave people with is I started off buying individual stocks. Like I started investing in 2018. The first investment I made was Amazon. And, that ended up being a good one. But then I picked a few others after that just tanked. And, here's the thing. So if my portfolio is made up of like 20 to 30 stocks, well, I'm the kind of person, I like to be hands-on. I like to be in the know. And then I'm actually forced to keep up with all those companies. I have an interest in it, but to be honest, I don't have a time to be pouring into like all the financial statements. I just don't. So that's why I'm starting to migrate now more to like a global, well-diversified ETF. So let's say every time I buy a company, I'll buy an equivalent amount of that ETF. That way I'm kind of 50-50 stocks and ETFs. So for me, that's just a good kind of balanced approach. And then real estate as well. So, we have started investing in real estate, started that just as the pandemic was kind of kicking off. And it's nothing fancy. It's been like pre-construction. So nothing really refined there, but that's my approach.
Yeah, it sounds like we have a very similar investing approach.
I think so.
It's good that students hear different approaches, right? Like I guess one other thing to mention is you said that you tend to pick some stocks and they tanked. If you're picking stocks that tank in your TFSA, you don't actually get that room back.
Yes.
So just be very careful because, you lose that money. You also lose that very valuable tax advantage room.
That's a very good point. And I can see why you kind of asked me about the crypto in the TFSA, but very valid point. Steph, maybe we could just like wrap it up with a little bit of rapid fire. You know what? They can be quick answers. They can be elaborate answers, whatever you like. So what's your best financial decision?
Probably getting an education in something that's high demand, like investing my time and money into getting my MD and then taking that time to go to business courses when I was doing my master's. It provided exponential returns on my knowledge. I remember reading somewhere that kids wanted to be like TikTok celebrities more than they wanted to be like a scientist, for example. But what they forget is you can get canceled on social media, or your account can get reported, and then there goes your entire livelihood. Even things like material possessions, right? Like houses and cars, like those can get repossessed. With divorce, basically you cut your net worth in half. Domestic violence, right? You have to leave everything behind in some cases. But if I were to tell like younger listeners or kids who listen to this, your education and your knowledge, once you get that, it can never be taken away from you. Once you've earned it, it's with you forever, and you can always use that to build yourself up again.
Okay, very, very good. Biggest financial blunder?
So probably when I was a student, I had a lot of scholarships coupled with a pretty minimalist lifestyle. So just to help my parents out, I gave them some of the money, like no questions asked. Then I come home from university and I see that they've bought an entire wicker furniture set just because Sears was having a liquidation sale. There was like new dining chairs and then like a new car. And I was just like, what's all this? Like, I had provided the money not to be spent on stuff like that. It was meant to go towards groceries and utilities, right?
Yeah.
So and so now every time I give my parents money, it would just directly deposit into their TFSA or RRSP. The lesson from this is basically, always ask questions about where your money is going, especially if you have a financial advisor or someone managing your money for you. They're paid to answer your questions. There's no such thing as too many questions or dumb questions. Yeah. It's important to take accountability of your own money rather than just handing it to someone else without question. And if you are planning to lend money, no questions asked, just assume or budget for the fact that you might not get it back.
Very good. Now, favorite financial resource?
Okay, so wow, there are so many, and I've definitely shared your podcast amongst others to med students. I've mentioned a few earlier throughout the talk we had today. If you go on my Instagram and then you click on the books highlight on the profile page, it will actually link to all the posts that I've done where I've reviewed financial books. If you're more of an audiovisual learner, if you go on my YouTube channel, and under the featured channels tab, I can't remember what it was called, I've actually featured some great YouTube channels that put out financial content that I've vetted. So I've tried to include like YouTubers that don't post videos that are like how I made $1 million day trading or top stock picks to become $1 million. Like I try to vet those out.
Okay, awesome. And so kind of you to spread word about the podcast, but best cheap or free activity in Toronto?
Yeah, so if you're under 35, you can always get $19 tickets to see the Toronto Symphony Orchestra as part of their soundcheck program. Orchestra Toronto, a separate company, also has the same deal as well. And what I like about it is that it's like a lot of the listeners, I'm guessing they're kind of like on the younger side. So, it's a fancy date idea that's actually pretty reasonably priced.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah, if you're under 25, you can go for free to the Art Gallery of Ontario. And you can also, if you're not, you can also just go for free on Wednesday nights. And given that it's December, I plan on going to the Distillery District Christmas Market, or I think they call it the Winter Market now. They changed the name, but it's free during regular hours and $8 from Friday to Sunday, I believe. But that's another example of a free or a low cost.
Is it free during the week? It's free during the week?
It's free during the week. Yeah.
Oh,
so
wow.
I plan on going like on a Thursday when it's free. But I think from Friday to Sunday, it's $8, which isn't
amazing.
Too bad.
That's
it's
amazing.
Like a family-friendly event.
Totally. Yeah, I have to take advantage of that. Steph, this was wonderful. I think we'll kind of wrap it up there. And, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. And I was just really excited to talk to you today just because of all the good work that you've been doing. And, it's amazing the knowledge you've acquired. And I think the people who have had a chance to listen to you, I think they should be fortunate that you're so willing to share it with the world. So I know it's been lovely talking to you over the computer, but maybe next time we can do it over a bubble tea.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. It's been wonderful to chat. Thanks for taking the time.
Great. Thanks, Yatin.
All right, there it is. I had an absolutely wonderful time talking to Dr. Steph Zhou, and I feel like there's a lot of information in this episode that is very relevant to students and trainees throughout all walks of life, including medical students and residents. So if you know someone who you think could benefit from the content in this episode, please feel free to share. And if you haven't done so already, I think Steph is doing a wonderful job on YouTube and Instagram. Her handle is @BreakingBadDebt. And she does a great job just kind of intertwining her interest in personal finance with her various life experiences into this really nice package of information that resonates with many, many people. So do check that out. And if you've got any questions for me, anytime, LinkedIn or beyondmdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the content that you're hearing in this podcast, please feel free to leave me a rating or review or feedback of any type. I would be so, so grateful. And again, as always, I appreciate you guys taking the time to join me. It means so much to me. And until next time, please stay well, stay safe, and stay savvy.